Hi there, and welcome to another edition of Coffee College. This is Omid G, the coffee professor. Today, we're going to talk about washed processed coffee. Most people, you go and buy a bag of coffee. Most people don't think about how was it processed. So, in this video, we're going to talk about wash process and why you need to know. You need to know: are you buying wash process, natural process, honey process, wet hulled process, or anaerobic process? Those are the most common. Wash process is probably the most common of all. Before I describe what it is, let me tell you where you see wash process coming from. Essentially, every country that produces coffee, with the exception of Brazil and Yemen, that I can think of, are producing wash process coffee. Ethiopia does a combination of washed and natural process. Pretty much the rest of the countries are almost exclusively doing wash process. Now, what is wash process? You have to remember that coffee is a fruit, so it's a cherry. They're picking these cherries. Pretty much every country in the world handpicks them, with the exception of Brazil. So they're handpicking these cherries. Hopefully, they're just picking the ones that are ripe. And you've got these huge baskets of cherries. Then they're taking them over to be depulped, and it could be mechanically or sometimes hand cranked, depending on the country. And pulping or depulping involves taking all of that rind off of the cherry. Now, an interesting factoid: that rind can be made into a tea. It's called cascara tea. And so the rind, which tastes nothing like coffee, and I've made it myself. I've picked cherry beans and taken off the rind. If you've ever had that drink called Bai, B-A-I, that has caffeine in it, but it's not from coffee and it's not from tea. At least it's not from coffee beans. It comes from that rind. And I've made cascara tea, literally taken the rind, dried it, made the tea. It's kind of fruity tasting, and it does have caffeine. In some countries that are quite poor, where the people don't have money to buy coffee, even though they're producing so much, they drink cascara tea just because they want caffeine and they can't afford any other option. It's taken then to be depulped. And there's something around the bean, in between the fruit and the bean itself, called a parchment layer. And this parchment layer is kind of like a stiff shell. It's very thin. It's kind of like an eggshell, but it's harder than an egg. Once it dries, it's sort of hard to break. And so what you have left is everything is taken off mechanically, almost everything. And then it goes into fermentation tanks with that parchment layer. So the beans are inside that parchment layer. And it goes to ferment, and it takes some of that slime off, the rest of the rind off. And it'll sit in the fermentation tanks usually for around 48 hours. And it'll ferment, and that is an oxygen-rich environment. I'll explain later about the anaerobic processing method that lacks oxygen. And then I should state one key difference with what Kenya does at this stage that no other country does. Kenya lets the beans stay in that fermentation tank for longer than any other country does, 48 to 96 hours. And that helps with the development of very sharp fruit tastes. And by sharp, I mean currant, cranberry, things like this. Not quite sour orange, but a zesty orange flavor. These are things you can only get with Kenyan coffee. And Kenya pretty much only makes wash process. So they do that, and it adds to some of what makes their coffee so unique. Everybody else who does wash process doesn't let it sit quite as long. And you can't develop those flavors just by doing that with any bean. It requires a Kenyan bean to do that. So for instance, if Mexico let their coffee sit in the fermentation tanks for much longer, it would not develop that cranberry or currant taste. It just wouldn't happen, because the bean doesn't have fruit flavors to begin with to develop in that capacity. So they sit in those tanks, they take them out. The parchment layer is mostly clean. Sometimes they go and take it to a washing station to get the rest of it off. Then you have a completely clean parchment. Now it goes out to drying beds. Now, technically, it could go to a drying mill where it's mechanically dried, but that's expensive. I don't know any countries who do that, but that, technology exists. But it's not widespread by any means. What people do is they lay it out to bed either on sun-dried, literally on the floor, or on elevated patios. So, for instance, Ethiopia does it on elevated patios, and so does Yemen, although that's all natural process. But then there's a lot of countries that just put it on the ground, just literally on the ground. And it seems gross, and you see the pictures, they're walking on it, they're, even sometimes riding motorcycles through it. But that parchment layer stays intact. And so the beans, they stay intact. The beans are inside. Then when it hits a particular moisture level, probably around 11%, then they pull they pull all those beans that are still in their parchment layer. Then they take it to a processing mill and they break off. Sometimes it's hand cranked, sometimes it's mechanically cranked. The more poor the country, the more poor the farmers are, the more likely they are to do hand cranked. So they're hand cranking it through this machine and taking that, cracking the parchment layer off, literally. Sometimes you end up with rocks and things like that going through. Probably out of every 100 pounds of beans I get, I end up with a rock. And I have to find it, otherwise it ends up in people's grinders, and then I have enemies. So it's hand cranked, and then you have the beans, and then they put them into the bags, and they get into the huge burlap bags, usually 130-pound bags, and then off they go. Now, what characterizes wash processed coffee? So with wash processed coffee, you get the truest assessment of what that bean tastes like. So through no other method are you going to get such a clear assessment of what that bean brings to the table. In other words, when you do a natural process, you're modifying the bean flavor. When you do a honey process, you're modifying it. Wet hold, you're modifying it. And anaerobic, you're modifying it. Wet process, if you like, you are getting the true flavor of what does that bean have, because you're getting rid of all of that fruit, all the mucilage. You're not allowing it to ferment enough to change the flavor. And so you find out what is it that bean brings to the table. And that flavor can vary depending on the region that it comes from. So really the things that drive the flavor are the cultivar. So not just the species, but within that species. So if it's Arabica, which it usually is, then what cultivar are we talking about? Is it bourbon? Is it Caturra? Is it Katukai? Is it, Typica? Is it SL28? Is it SL32? Is it, and going on and on and on. What kind of, is it Pacamara? Is it something else, The cultivar drives it to a certain extent. The next thing that drives it is elevation. And I'll talk more about that in another video, but the higher the elevation, typically the more the vibrancy and acidity of the bean. And that'll come through in wash process. The next thing that'll drive it is whether or not it's shade grown or grown in full sun. And typically, most countries grow on mountains. So if you're on a mountain, at least part of the day, it's going to be in shade, either the morning or the afternoon. It can't be in the sun the whole day. And then the next thing is what type of soil you have, and the more volcanic it is, which most coffee growing countries have, the more acidic and vibrant it's going to be. And then what type of water you have is going to influence it too. So all of these are factors. To me, the most acidic beans are coming out of Kenya and Ethiopia. And then the less acidic beans tend to be coming out of regions that are lower in elevation. And I'll have another video where I talk about what flavor profiles you get from each country. And the wash process coffee can at times have a tea-like flavor. It can be so clean, especially the East Africans can have a very tea-like flavor. Um, and then how would you be able to drink these? So actually, let me give a range of the sorts of flavor profiles you might get from wash coffee. So you might get very floral. You might get stone fruit. You might get berries like strawberry or blueberry. Or in other cases, for instance, some of the Central Americans and some of the South Americans, you might get subtle fruit tones. You might get caramel. You might get cocoa notes. Um, you might get flavors of nuts. If you go to India, then I am getting into what I didn't want to get into, which is the flavor profiles by region. But you can have flavors of roasted grain and malts and things like that. So it all really varies, you know. But those are some of the range of things that you might kind of expect. From very sweet to more muted to more chocolatey to more caramel. And then you can have subtle fruit tones and things like that. How would you drink wash process? Pretty much any way you like. It can be filter, it can be pour over, it can be Chemex, it can be any of those kind of things. The only area where wash process is not really super recommended is for espresso. And you can drink it. I do it for espresso, which is my go-to drink. But the deal is that wash process has typically very little crema. And crema, when you see that cream coming out of the espresso machine when you pull the lever, that's crema. And crema, and again, I'll have a video on this coming up, but crema carries that flavor from that the bean provides. And so you want crema. Crema's a really important thing in espresso. If you're doing wash process, because it's such a clean flavor, because it lacks any kind of crema that was imparted that typically comes through from the rind when you do natural process, because you lack those things, then you'll pull a shot that's very thin on crema. The crema, even if it has crema, it'll dissipate very quickly before you can get it into the milk. And so you'll get it'll be more like concentrated coffee instead of a true espresso experience. So anyway, that's the scoop on wash process coffee. Now, typically you're looking at a blend. There's times when you're buying just one type of coffee. But if you're going to the store and just picking up a coffee that has a name, but that name is not a country and a region or something like that, then you're getting a blend. And there's a very good possibility that there's multiple types of coffees in there. So it could be wash process. Right now, somebody gave me some coffee, which is funny when people give me coffee. I looked at what was in it, or I researched it. It had South American, Central American, Indonesian, and African, and there was nothing it didn't have. So it had to have had every type of processing method there is. So it's only when you get the coffee from a particular region, typically, that you can look at it and it'll be potentially wash process, and usually it is. So now you know all about wash process coffee. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Coffee College. I'm Omid G, the coffee professor, and we shall see you next time. Please share, like, comment, and subscribe. Bye for now.